What's up, everybody? Welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev. Each episode we read about half an hour of history together, and we're reading Chapter 10 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Let's just dig right in. Most unions, however, this is obviously continuing for the last episode, most unions, however, still kept Negroes out or asked them to form their own locals. The National Labor Union began to expend more and more of its energy on political issues, especially currency reform, a demand for the issuance of paper money, greenbacks. As it became less an organizer of labor struggles and more a lobbyist with Congress concerned with voting, it lost vitality. An observer of the labor scene, F.A. Sorge, although if he's Scandinavian and he might pronounce his name Sorga, but I'll go with an Americanized pronunciation of Sorge, wrote in 1870 to Karl Marx in England, "The National Labor Union, which had such brilliant prospects in the beginning of its career, was poisoned by greenbackism and is slowly but surely dying." Perhaps unions could not easily see the limits to legislative reform in an age where such reform laws were being passed for the first time and hopes were high. The Pennsylvania legislature in 1869 passed a Mine Safety Act, providing for the regulation and ventilation of mines and for the protection of the lives of the miners. Only after 100 years of continuing accidents in those mines, 100 years, would it be understood how insufficient those words were, except as a device to calm anger among miners. In 1873, another economic crisis devastated the nation. It was the closing of the banking house of J. Cook, the banker who during the war had made $3 million a year in commissions alone for selling government bonds, that started the wave of panic. And I don't need to tell you, $3 million in 1873 was a lot more money than $3 million is now, and it's a lot of money now. I say that a lot, don't I? Well, it's important to point out, while President Grant slept in Cook's Philadelphia mansion on September 18, 1873, the banker rode downtown to lock the door on his bank. Now people could not pay loans on mortgages. 5,000 businesses closed and put their workers on the street. It was more than J. Cook. The crisis was built into a system which was chaotic in its nature, in which only the very rich were secure. It was a system of periodic crisis. 1837, 1857, 1873, and later 1893, 1907, 1919, 1929, that wiped out small businesses and brought cold, hunger, and death to working people, while the fortunes of the Astors, Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, Morgans kept growing through war and peace, crisis and recovery. During the 1873 crisis, Carnegie was capturing the steel market. Rockefeller was wiping out his competitors in oil. Labor depression in Brooklyn was the headline in the New York Herald. In November 1873, it listed closings and layoffs. A felt skirt factory, a picture frame factory, a glass cutting establishment, and a steelworks factory. And women's trades, milliners, dressmakers, shoebinders. The Depression continued through the 1870s. During the first 3 months of 1874, 90,000 workers, almost half of them women, had to sleep in police stations in New York. They were known as revolvers because they were limited to 1 or 2 days a month in any one police station and so had to keep moving. Wow. All over the country, people were evicted from their homes. Many roamed the cities looking for food. Desperate workers tried to get to Europe or to South America. In 1878, the SS Metropolis, filled with laborers, left the United States for South America and sank with all aboard. Oh. The New York Tribune reported 1 hour after the news that the ship had gone down arrived in Philadelphia. The ship had gone down arrived in Philadelphia. The office of Mr. Collins was besieged by hundreds of hunger-bitten decent men begging for the places of the drowned laborers. Mass meeting and demonstrations of the unemployed took place all over the country. Unemployed councils were set up. A meeting in New York at Cooper Institute in late 1873, organized by trade unions and the American section of the First International, founded in 1864 in Europe by Marx and others, drew a huge crowd, overflowing into the streets. The meeting asked that before bills became law, they should be approved by a public vote, that no individual should own more than $30,000. They asked for an 8-hour day. Also, whereas we are industrious, law-abiding citizens who had paid all taxes and given support and allegiance to the government, resolved that we will in this time of need supply ourselves and our families with proper food and shelter, and we will send our bills to the city treasury to be liquidated until we shall obtain work. In Chicago, 20,000 unemployed marched through streets to City Hall asking bread for the needy, clothing for the naked, and houses for the homeless. Actions like this resulted in some relief for about 10,000 families. In January 1874, in New York City, a huge parade of workers kept by the police from approaching City Hall went to Tompkins Square, and there were told by the police they couldn't have the meeting. They stayed, and the police attacked. One newspaper reported, police clubs rose and fell. Women and children ran screaming in all directions. Many of them were trampled underfoot in the stampede for the gates. In the street, bystanders were ridden down and mercilessly clubbed by mounted officers. Strikes were called in the textile mills of Fall River, Massachusetts. In the anthracite coal district of Pennsylvania, there was the long strike where Irish members of a society called the Ancient Order of Hibernians were accused of acts of violence, mostly on the testimony of a detective planted among the miners. These were the Molly Maguires. They were tried and found guilty. Philip Foner believes, after a study of the evidence, that they were framed because they were labor organizers. He quotes the sympathetic Irish World, which called them intelligent men whose direction gave strength to the resistance of the miners to the inhuman reduction of their wages. And he points to the Miners' Journal, put out by the coal mine owners, which referred to the executed men this way. What did they do? Whenever prices of labor did not suit them, they organized and proclaimed a strike. That's what they did. That's what they did with mine, not his quote. Just want to be clear. Altogether, 19 were executed according to Anthony Bimba. There were scattered protests from working men's organizations, but no mass movement that could stop the executions. It was a time when employers brought in recent immigrants desperate for work different from the strikers in language and culture to break strikes. Italians were imported into the bituminous coal area around Pittsburgh in 1874 to replace striking miners. I hope I pronounced that all right. Bituminous. This led to the killing of 3 Italians to trials in which jurors of the community exonerated the strikers, and bitter feelings between Italians and other organized workers. The centennial year of 1876, 100 years after the Declaration of Independence, brought forth a number of new declarations. Whites and blacks separately expressed their disillusionment. A Negro Declaration of Independence denounced the Republican Party on which they had once depended to gain full freedom, and proposed independent political action by colored voters. And the Working Men's Party of Illinois, a July 4th celebration organized by German socialists in Chicago, said in its Declaration of Independence, "The present system has enabled capitalists to make law in their own interests to the injury and oppression of the workers. It has made the name democracy, for which our forefathers fought and died, a mockery and a shadow. By giving to property an unproportionate amount of representation and control over legislation. It has enabled capitalists to secure government aid, inland grants, and money loans to selfish railroad companies who, by monopolizing the means of transportation, are enabled to swindle both the producer and the consumer. It has presented to the world the absurd spectacle of a deadly civil war for the abolition of Negro slavery, while the majority of the white population, those who have created all the wealth of the nation, are compelled to suffer under a bondage infinitely more galling and humiliating. It has allowed the capitalists as a class to appropriate annually 5/6 of the entire production of the country. It has therefore prevented mankind from fulfilling their natural destinies on earth, crushed out ambition, prevented marriages, or caused false and unnatural ones, has shortened human life, destroyed morals, and fostered crime, corrupted judges, ministers, and statesmen, shattered confidence, love, and honor among men, and made life a selfish, merciless struggle for existence, instead of a noble and generous struggle for perfection, in which equal advantages should be given to all, and human lives relieved from an unnatural and degrading competition for bread. We therefore, the representatives of the workers of Chicago, in mass meeting assembled, do solemnly publish and declare that we are absolved from all allegiance to the existing political parties of this country, and that as free and independent producers, we shall endeavor to acquire the full power to make our own laws, manage our own production, and govern ourselves, acknowledging no rights without duties, no duties without rights. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the assistance and cooperation of all working men, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our means, and our sacred honor." Wow. Nice speech. In the year 1877, the country was in the depths of the Depression. That summer, in the hot cities where poor families lived in cellars and drank infested water, the children became sick in large numbers. The New York Times wrote, "Already the cry of the dying children begins to be heard. Soon, to judge from the past, there will be 1,000 deaths of infants per week in the city." That first week in July in Baltimore, where all liquid sewage ran through the streets, 139 babies died. That year there came a series of tumultuous strikes by railroad workers in a dozen cities. They shook the nation as no labor conflict in its history has done. It began with wage cuts on railroad after railroad in tense situations of already low wages. $1.75 a day for brakemen working 12 hours. Scheming and profiteering by the railroad companies. Deaths and injuries among the workers. Loss of hands, feet, fingers the crushing of men between cars. Oh. At the Baltimore and Ohio station in Martinsburg, West Virginia, workers determined to fight the wage cut went on strike, uncoupled the engines, ran them into the roundhouse, and announced no more trains would leave Martinsburg until the 10% cut was canceled. A crowd of support gathered, too many for the local police to disperse. Baltimore and Ohio, B&O Railroad from Monopoly. B&O officials asked the governor for military protection, and he sent in the militia. A train tried to get through, protected by the militia, and the striker trying to derail it exchanged gunfire with the militiaman attempting to stop him. The striker was shot in his thigh and his arm. His arm was amputated later that day, and 9 days later he died. 600 freight trains now jammed the yards at Martinsburg. The West Virginia governor applied to newly elected President Rutherford Hayes for federal troops, saying the state militia was insufficient. In fact, the militia was not totally reliable, being composed of many railroad workers. Much of the U.S. Army was tied up in Indian battles in the West. Congress had not appropriated money for the Army yet, but J.P. Morgan, August Belmont, and other bankers now offered to lend money to pay Army officers, but no enlisted men. Federal troops arrived in Martinsburg, and the freight cars began to move. In Baltimore, a crowd of thousands sympathetic to the railroad strikers surrounded the armory of the National Guard, which had been called out by the governor at the request of the B&O Railroad. The crowd hurled rocks and the soldiers came out firing. The streets now became the scene of a moving, bloody battle. When the evening was over, 10 men or boys were dead. More badly wounded, one soldier wounded. Half of the 120 troops quit, and the rest went on to the train depot, where a crowd of 200 smashed the engine of a passenger train, tore up tracks, and engaged the militia again in a running battle. By now, 15,000 people surrounded the depot. Soon, 3 passenger cars, the station platform, and a locomotive were on fire. The governor asked for federal troops, and Hayes responded. 500 soldiers arrived, and Baltimore quieted down. The rebellion of the railroad workers now spread. Joseph Dacus, then editor of the St. Louis Republican, reported, "Strikes were occurring almost every hour. The great state of Pennsylvania was in an uproar. New Jersey was afflicted by a paralyzing dread. New York was mustering an army of militia. Ohio was shaken from Lake Erie to the Ohio River. Indiana rested in a dreadful suspense. Illinois, and especially its great metropolis, Chicago, apparently hung on the verge of a vortex of confusion and tumult." St. Louis had already felt the effect of the premonitory shocks of the uprising. The strike spread to Pittsburgh and the Pennsylvania Railroad. Again, it happened outside the regular union, pent-up anger exploding without plan. Robert Bruce, historian of the 1877 strikes, writes about a flagman named Gus Harris. Harris refused to go out on a double-header, a train with 2 locomotives carrying a double length of cars, to which railroaders had objected because it required fewer workers and made the brakemen's work more dangerous. The decision was his own, not part... This is Robert Bruce, the historian's words. The decision was his own, not part of a concerted plan or a general understanding. Had he lain awake that past night, listening to the rain, asking himself if he dared quit, wondering if anyone would join him, weighing the chances? Or had he simply risen to a breakfast that did not fill him, seen his children go off shabbily and half-fed, walked brooding through the damp morning, and then yielded impassively to stored-up rage? When Harris said he would not go, the rest of the crew refused too. The strikers now multiplied, joined by young boys and men from the mills and factories. Pittsburgh had 33 iron mills, 73 glass factories, 29 oil refineries, 158 coal mines. The freight trains stopped moving out of the city. The trainman's union had not organized this, but it moved to take hold, called a meeting, invited all working men to make common cause with their brethren on the railroad. Railroad and local officials decided that the Pittsburgh militia would not kill their fellow townsmen and urged that Philadelphia troops be called in. Philadelphia troops because they wanted the Pittsburgh strikers to be killed. That's cold and disturbing. Railroad officials by now 2,000 cars were idle in Pittsburgh. The Philadelphia troops came in and began to clear the track. Rocks flew. Gunfire was exchanged between crowd and troops. At least 10 people were killed, all working men, most of them not railroaders. Now the whole city rose in anger. A crowd surrounded the troops, who moved into a roundhouse. Railroad cars were set afire. Buildings began to burn, and finally, the roundhouse itself, the troops marching out of it to safety. There was more gunfire. The Union Depot was set afire. Thousands looted the freight cars. A huge grain elevator in a small section of the city went up in flames. In a few days, 24 people had been killed, including 4 soldiers. 79 buildings had been burned to the ground. Something like a general strike was developing in Pittsburgh. Mill workers, car workers, miners, laborers, and the employees at the Carnegie Steel plant. And I can't help but think that if this kind of thing was going on in today's day and age, that the newspapers and CNN would be reporting that these people were dangerous criminals and that 4 police officers were killed, and not really mentioning the rest. Not that police officers' lives aren't important, but it's the establishment. The establishment protects its own. The entire National Guard of Pennsylvania, 9,000 men, was called out. The entire National Guard of Pennsylvania. But many of the companies couldn't move as strikers in other towns held up traffic. In Lebanon, Pennsylvania, one National Guard company mutinied and marched through an excited town. In Altoona, troops surrounded by rioters, immobilized by sabotaged engines, surrendered, stacked arms, fraternized with the crowd, and then were allowed to go home, to the accompaniment of singing by a quartet in an all-Negro militia company. Happy ending. We should end there. Nope, not really. In Harrisburg, the state capital, as at so many places, teenagers made up a large part of the crowd, which included some Negroes. Philadelphia militia, on their way home from Altoona, shook hands with the crowd, gave up their guns, marched like captives through the streets, were fed at a hotel, and sent home. The crowd agreed to the mayor's request to deposit the surrendered guns at the city hall. Factories and shops were idle. After some looting, citizens' patrols kept order in the streets through the night. Where strikers did not manage to take control, as in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, it may well have been because of a disunity. The spokesman of the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company in that town wrote, "The men have no organization, and there is too much race jealousy existing among them to permit them to form one." In Reading, Pennsylvania, there was no such problem. 90% were native born, the rest mostly German. There the railroad was 2 months behind in paying wages, and a branch of the trainmen's union was organized. 2,000 people gathered while men who had blackened their faces with coal dust set about methodically tearing up tracks, jamming switches, derailing cars, setting fire to cabooses and also to a railroad bridge. A National Guard company arrived fresh from duty at the execution of the Molly Maguires. The crowd threw stones, fired pistols. The soldiers fired into the crowd. 6 men lay dead in the twilight, Bruce reports. A fireman and an engineer formerly employed in the Reading, a carpenter, a huckster, a rolling mill worker, a laborer. A policeman and another man lay at the point of death. 5 of the wounded died. The crowd grew angrier, more menacing. A contingent of soldiers announced it would not fire. One soldier saying he would rather put a bullet through the president of Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron. The 16th Regiment of the Morristown Volunteers stacked its arms. Some militia threw their guns away and gave their ammunition to the crowd. When the guardsmen left for home, federal troops arrived and took control, and local police began making arrests. Meanwhile, the leaders of the big railway brotherhoods, the Order of Railway Conductors, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, the Brotherhood of Engineers, disavowed the strike. There was talk in the press of communistic ideas, widely entertained by the workmen employed in mines and factories and by the railroads. In fact, there was a very active working men's party in Chicago with several thousand members, most of them immigrants from Germany and Bohemia, which is in the Czech Republic, formerly Czechoslovakia. It was connected with the First International in Europe. In the midst of the railroad strikes that summer of 1877, it called a rally. 6,000 people came and demanded nationalization of the railroads. Albert Parsons gave a fiery speech. He was from Alabama, had fought in the Confederacy during the Civil War, married a brown-skinned woman of Spanish and Indian blood, worked as a typesetter, and was one of the best English-speaking orators the Working Men's Party had. The next day, a crowd of young people, not especially connected with the rally of the evening before, began moving through the railroad yards, closed down the freights, went to the factories, called out the mill workers, the stockyard workers, the crewmen on the Lake Michigan ships, closed down the brickyards and lumber yards. That day also, Albert Parsons was fired from his job with the Chicago Times and declared blacklisted. The police attacked the crowds. The press reported the sound of clubs falling on skulls was sickening for the first minute until one grew accustomed to it. A rioter dropped at every whack, it seemed, for the ground was covered with them. 2 companies of U.S. that's the end of the quotation. 2 companies of U.S. infantry arrived, joining National Guardsmen and Civil War veterans. Police fired into a surging crowd and 3 men were killed. The next day, an armed crowd of 5,000 fought the police. The police fired again and again, and when it was over and the dead were counted, they were, as usual, working men and boys, 18 of them, their skulls smashed by clubs, their vital organs pierced by gunfire. The one city where the Working Men's Party clearly led the rebellion was St. Louis, a city of flour mills, foundries, packing houses, machine shops, breweries, and railroads. Here, as elsewhere, there were wage cuts on the railroads, and here there were perhaps 1,000 members of the Working Men's Party, many of them bakers, coopers, cabinet makers, cigar makers, brewery workers. The party was organized in 4 sections by nationality: German, English, French, Bohemian. All four sections took a ferry across the Mississippi to join a mass meeting of railroad men in East St. Louis. One of their speakers told the meeting, "All you have to do, gentlemen, for you to have the numbers, is to unite on one idea, that the working men shall rule the country. What man makes belongs to him, and the working men made this country." Railroaders in East St. Louis declared themselves on strike. The mayor of East St. Louis was a European immigrant, himself an active revolutionist as a youth, and railroad men's votes dominated the city. I think we're getting close to half an hour, but I've got about 2 pages left, so I'm just going to push through. In St. Louis itself, the Working Men's Party called an open-air mass meeting to which 5,000 people came. The party was clearly in the leadership of the strike. Speakers excited by the crowd became more militant. Capital has changed liberty into serfdom, and we must fight or die. They called for nationalization of the railroads, mines, and all industry. At another huge meeting of the Workmen's Party, a black man spoke for those who worked on the steamboats and levees. He asked, "Will you stand to us regardless of color?" The crowd shouted back, "We will." An executive committee was set up, and it called for a general strike of all branches of industry in St. Louis. Handbills for the general strike were soon all over the city. There was a march of 400 Negro steamboat men and roustabouts along the river. 600 factory workers carrying a banner, no monopoly, working men's rights. A great procession moved through the city, ending with a rally of 10,000 people listening to communist speakers. The people are rising up in their might and declaring they will no longer submit to being oppressed by unproductive capital. David Burbank, in his book on the St. Louis events, Reign of the Rabble, writes, "Only around St. Louis did the original strike on the railroads expand into such a systematically organized and complete shutdown of all industry that the term general strike is fully justified. And only there did the socialists assume undisputed leadership. No American city has come so close to being ruled by a workers' Soviet, as we would now call it, as St. Louis, Missouri in the year 1877. The railroad strikes were making news in Europe. Marx wrote Engels, "What do you think of the workers of the United States? This first explosion against the associated oligarchy of capital which has occurred since the Civil War will naturally again be suppressed, but can very well form the point of origin of an earnest workers' party." It doesn't say what Engels' response was. In New York, several thousand gathered at Tompkins Square. The tone of the meeting was moderate, speaking of a political revolution through the ballot box. And, "If you will unite, we may have here within 5 years a socialist republic. Then will a lovely morning break over this darkened land." It was a peaceful meeting. It adjourned. The last words heard from the platform were, "Whatever we poor men may not have, we have free speech, and no one can take it from us." Then the police charged, using their clubs. I'm confused by the sentence, "it adjourned," but then it ended with police clubbing people? That doesn't sound like adjourning. In St. Louis, as elsewhere, the momentum of the crowds, the meetings, the enthusiasm could not be sustained. As they diminished, the police, militia, and federal troops moved in and the authorities took over. The police raided the headquarters of the Working Men's Party. The police raided the headquarters of the Working Men's Party and arrested 70 people. The executive committee that had been for a while virtually in charge of the city was now in prison. The strikers surrendered. surrendered. The strikers surrendered. The wage cuts remained. 131 strike leaders were fired by the Burlington Railroad. When the Great Railroad Strikes of 1877 were over, 100 people were dead, 1,000 people had gone to jail, 100,000 workers had gone on strike, and the strikes had roused into action countless unemployed in the cities. More than half the freight on the nation's 75,000 miles of track had stopped running at the height of the strikes. The railroads made some concessions, withdrew some wage cuts, but also strengthened their coal and iron police. In a number of large cities, National Guard armories were built with loopholes for guns. Robert Bruce believes the strikes taught many people of the hardships of others, and that they led to congressional railroad regulation. They may have stimulated the business unionism of the American Federation of Labor, as well as the national unity of labor proposed by the Knights of Labor and the independent labor farmer parties of the next 2 decades. In 1877, the same year, blacks learned they did not have enough strength to make real the promise of equality in the Civil War. Working people learned they were not united enough, not powerful enough, to defeat the combination of private capital and government power. But there was more to come. Thank you for joining me. That's the end of chapter 10. If you like what you heard, hit the like and subscribe button and the notification bell. But before you go, I just want to point out that, when you talk about when the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or any party takes credit for these movements, for the labor, for the strikes, for the 8-hour day, the 10-hour day, child labor laws, any of that stuff, they say the Democratic Party brought it. It wasn't the Democratic Party. It was the people. The people fought for it, and it was bloody. Hit that like and subscribe button. Thank you.